A little bit of housekeeping. I believe Jerry's in the process of muting you all, so apologies, but we want to be able to hear Reverend Matt as clearly as possible. So I want to welcome everybody to our very first Sangha Speaker Series event. This is Dealing with Racism and Hate, the Jodo Shinshu approach, featuring Reverend Matt Hamasaki of the Sacramento Battalora. So tonight was arranged by our very own Sangha Initiative, which is a group of younger adults with the objective of producing programs and services for the temple with an eye towards the future. And we want to give special thanks to the Southern District Buddhist Women's Association, who provided a grant to help fund this event. I want to ask all of you to please save your questions for later, as there will be a Q&A session at the end. And if you would like to submit a question, please send them to the host via private chat. And please, we did disable the chat function for everyone. So we just want to keep things as smooth as possible. So we will try to address as many questions as possible, subject to our time limitations for this event. And we are planning for it to end around 8:30 p.m. or when the rest of us conk out. So we want to also share the various communities, churches, areas that everyone is coming from. So if you could please change your participant name to include your temple or community or city name. And we will be recording this event for future playback on YouTube. So if you would prefer to not be seen, I advise you to please stop your video at this time or once you sign in. Or you've already signed in. So at this time, if you want to stop your video, this is your last chance. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our Reverend Kory, who will be introducing Reverend Matt for the remainder of the program. Reverend Kory.
Thank you. I was trying to figure out how I can unmute myself if I wasn't the host. So that's why I couldn't do that. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Michelle, for taking the lead on this project, this current project for tonight. And thank you, Reverend Matt. It's good to see him in person, or at least online. Let me give you a little background for Reverend Matt Hamasaki. He grew up in Berkeley, California. He went to UC Davis, where he made a friend, or many friends, but one of them was our own Stephen Sharp at UC Davis. I don't know if you remember him, Reverend Matt, but he remembers you very well. Then he went to IBS, or Institute of Buddhist Studies, where we became classmates. I got to meet him through the Minister Assistant Program and through IBS. We both graduated in 2015, and after that, we got our Tokudo together at 2012, and in 2015 we graduated together, where he started in Fresno, or Central Cal, on August 1st, the same day I started at Venice Honganji Buddhist Temple. Since then, he started at Sacramento Buddhist Temple, where he, in 2018, where he is so successful and such a wonderful minister that he is now not just Reverend Matthew Hamasaki, but he's Fuku Rimban, or the interim Rimban of the Sacramento Battalora. So, before we keep going, I just wanted to thank him again for being our guest speaker. And also, even more importantly, thank his lovely wife, Michelle, for allowing him to spend time with us. And his little one, I believe your little one's 9 months now or so, right, Sensei?
Almost 8.
Almost 8 months. Oh. And I'm not even, I'm sorry, I can't remember if it's a boy or a girl. Can you please introduce your little one for us?
Oh, yeah. So, man, my little girl, she's actually sleeping right now, so I can't really show her to everybody. But yeah.
We're very happy that you're having such a wonderful time in Sacramento, and you're able to take your some of that wonderful time to spend with us tonight, and hopefully in the future to plug if you'd be willing to speak for our temple, for our guest speaker in the future, we'd be happy with that too. Actually, very happy. But everyone, thank you for joining in, and let's all please welcome Reverend Matthew Hamasaki. Oh yes, I was just chatted to please join me in Gassho before we start anything else. I was so excited for having Matt Sensei here that I forgot. Gassho Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Hai. And may I introduce Reverend Matthew Hamasaki, Sacramento, Betsy.
Thank you so much, Reverend Kory. It's good to see you too. Reverend Kory and I went through Tokudo and Kyoshi together, so we had that bonding experience of the shared suffering. So we're good friends. I didn't realize there was people here who knew me from college, so hopefully they don't say anything about how I was in college. I'd like to thank, of course, Reverend Kory, the Venice Temple, for allowing me this opportunity to speak. I'm very honored and humbled that anyone would think of me. It was mentioned that people were coming in because it was me, and so, not necessarily the subject. So maybe it's kind of like Ohtani, and people come to see me just because I'm eye candy, but that's whatever gets you into temple, I guess. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a presentation. Okay. So can everyone see my presentation okay? Yep. Yes. Okay. Very good. Okay. So the subject for today is dealing with racism and hate, a Jodo Shinshu approach. Before we start, though, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. And while I am in Sacramento, everyone else from all over, I would like to acknowledge the land that Sacramento has been built on. So the history of the Sacramento area and the people is rich in heritage, culture, and tradition. This area was and still is the tribal land of the Nisean people. Sacramento was a gathering place for many local tribes who have lived throughout the Central Valley and the foothills for generations and were original stewards of this land. We'd like to acknowledge the Southern Maidu people of the North, the Valley and the Plains, Miwok peoples of the south of the American River. We'd also like to honor the Patwin Wintun peoples of the west of the Sacramento River. We acknowledge that we are standing on the tribal lands of Sacramento's indigenous people. And for those who have not heard a land acknowledgement before, a land acknowledgement is a formal statement of public recognition of the indigenous people who have been dispossessed and displaced from their ancestral homelands and territories due to a variety of colonial and historical reasons. This statement acknowledges that an organization, a city, a park, or any other structure was built and operates on indigenous people's ancestral homelands. And why this is important is that land acknowledgements are not about placing blame. These statements are the first steps towards building a more inclusive future where we eliminate the ongoing erasure of indigenous people's voices, lives, and history. Land acknowledgements can be an entry point and pathway for education. Our land acknowledgement statement may be your first experience hearing about indigenous peoples in the area, which provides an opportunity to seed the path for learning and for respect to blossom and grow. So I was able to find that online, just searching for like, oops, Siri heard me. Okay, I found that online with the Sacramento, just searching, Sacramento land acknowledgement. So I encourage all of you for your own cities, wherever you are, to learn a little bit about the people who maybe have been displaced from being there. Okay, so now getting into the the lecture, I guess. I've been working on speaking longer because it's hard for me to speak more than like 6 or 7 minutes, which is probably why people like my Dharma talks. But I've been getting better at it, so now I can get kind of long-winded. Anyway, Buddha and Buddhism. So we're all Buddhists, right? And what does that mean? Is we follow the teachings of the Buddha. We follow this tradition called Buddhism. And the Buddha is the awakened one. That is how it's often translated from the Sanskrit. And what he awoke to was the truth of reality. Now, we're going to be dealing a lot with language, with words, and I try to be very intentional with the words that I use. And so I hope people don't necessarily maybe recognize it, but then just think about the meaning of the words that we use. So for instance, this idea of truth. What is true? I think everyone understands maybe on the basic level what truth is, but when you think about it, how can we determine what is actually true or not? Is it what's taught in schools? Is it in the history books? Is it what's learned from our parents? What is it that is true, and why do we accept it as though? So again, there's going to be questions that I bring up, things that I want everyone to think about. It may or may not be answered during my lecture, and you may or may not agree with what I say. But I think what's most important for me is to get people to start questioning and really thinking about these different kind of concepts that are going to come up, and try to find these answers for themselves. Okay, so as we're now really focusing, I don't know, I really like etymology and all that stuff. But anyway, hate. So we're talking about hate, and hate is a very, very broad term. When we're speaking just about the English language, hate is defined in the Cambridge Dictionary as to dislike someone or something very much, which I think, everyone understands. If you hate something, you don't just dislike it, you dislike it very much. In the Buddhist concept, hate is often one of the translations of one of the three poisons, or dvesha, which is translated as anger or aversion, but it also can be translated as hatred. So the three poisons, a lot of times people remember them through the acronym of GAS, right, with the greed, anger, and stupidity. But these are also known as greed, clinging, anger or aversion, and ignorance. So clinging is craving what we want. Aversion is dislike for what we don't want. And ignorance is thinking we can get what we want and avoid what we don't. So those are the three poisons. That's my understanding of hate within the Buddhist context. However, I think probably what is on everyone's minds right now is we hear this term going around, stop hate against AAPI, right? Stopping hate against Asian American and Pacific Islanders. And so when we talk about that kind of hate, that is a very specific kind of hate. We throw the term hate around a lot, and a lot of people use it in a lot of different contexts. But I think we have to, again, be careful about how we're using this word, as it is referring to something very, very specific. So hate defined, at least in California, under Penal Code 42255 PC. Actually, I don't know. I don't do penal codes. I don't know if that's how you say it right. Anyway, it defines it as a criminal act committed in whole or in part because of the victim's actual or perceived disability, gender, nationality, race or ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, or association with a person or group with one or more of these actual or perceived characteristics. So for today, we're going to be talking about race or ethnicity, as it is, Asian American Pacific Islander is this supposed, race or ethnicity. And a hate crime would be a criminal act because of that actual or perceived race or ethnicity. So again, this hate that we're talking about is a criminal act committed in whole or in part because someone is Asian or Pacific Islander. When we start talking about race or ethnicity, I think it's important to recognize that, or not important, it is vital to recognize that racism in America, as we understand it, is a uniquely American issue. White supremacy has been woven into the fabric of the United States since its inception. So everything that we understand about racism is uniquely American. If we go to different countries, it's understood in a different way. And so I wanted to give kind of a brief example of perhaps what that means. I don't know. This may or may not help. It might be more confusing. But anyway, when I was in college, I was in a film study class, and we looked at this movie Hunger in 2008 about the protests by the Irish Republican Army and the Irish National Liberation Army against the colonization of Ireland by the British. So the premise of this is that the British see the Irish as less human than them, and so they have the right to colonize Ireland. Now, these two liberation armies were fighting against the colonialization, and they were doing these protests by, they were doing dirty protests, blanket protests, and hunger protests, which, you could look up. But it was essentially this idea that the British thought the Irish were less human than they were. And this was a very confusing idea to understand to me. It's very difficult for me to accept because in my eyes, British and Irish are both white. And so how could they not both see that they were the same, right? But it's my purely American mind looking at this other context. And so it was kind of, at the time, I didn't really think anything of it. I was just like, okay, whatever. But after much, growing and research and education, I've started to understand why that was a very, very important thing for the Irish to fight for. So that's just kind of a brief, I don't know, thing that maybe connected me to it. But anyway, so the creation of whiteness. The concept of whiteness did not exist before 1600. Just to put that out there, that it did not exist. It was created in this context. So as the British were colonizing the new land, they brought over European and African laborers and initially loosely set up both indentured servitude and slavery. So it was possible for either of them to escape servitude and become a landowner and do pretty well. So as an indentured servant, usually people from Britain were very, very poor. They couldn't afford to eat. And so they signed this contract with the king to come over to the New World and act as an indentured servant. There was for a term, and then they would eventually serve out that term and then could be free. Slaves could also be free in some way. There's evidence of them being free in like wills and stuff like that. So there's the possibility for either of them to be free. And when they do finally get out of that servitude, they were able to become landowners and then create their own, kind of wealth in some way. So there was still prejudice and hierarchical attitudes, but there was nothing in governance. So there was no laws or anything, but there were feelings of like, oh yeah, African people thought that they were better than the Europeans, and Germans thought they were better than Irish, and all these different things. So there's this prejudice and hierarchical attitudes, but nothing in the law. So this is all until Bacon's Rebellion, which is a turning point. So this turning point in history, cited often by historians in this context. So in 1676, Nathaniel Bacon was a wealthy white landowner who was related to then Governor of Virginia, William Berkeley. Bacon wanted to remove all Native Americans in retaliation for raids that they had, and also to expand his land further. So if Native Americans were in the land around him, he couldn't expand it that way, he couldn't grow his wealth, and so he wanted to kick them out. Berkeley, the governor, was afraid that this would unite all of the tribes together, resulting in a very costly war with huge amounts of collateral damage. However, rebelling against the governor's wishes, Bacon put together his own militia made up of European and African indentured servants and African slaves who were promised freedom for their participation. So this is also during a time where initially, when they were sending people to the New World, a huge population boom and a lot of people who were very, very poor, who were willing to go into indentured servitude. But as the population, kind of has its ups and downs, it started going down. There wasn't as many people, and so there was less labor, and as less labor, there was less opportunities for those who became free. There was less land. It was just harder for everyone in general, and also the indentured servants, because there was less of them coming in. They started to get punishments that were very, very harsh for like the smallest things to add on to their servitude. And that way they would be in contract longer without having to, purchase anybody new. So they had more years out of each person. And so there's a lot of people who were unhappy. And that was why Bacon was able to get such a militia so easily. There's plenty of people who were willing to fight for this, kind of better life. They attacked nearby tribes, but eventually it became a battle between the militia versus Berkeley, the Virginia House of, I think that's Burgesses, and the rest of the colony's elite. So Bacon's forces did very well. They actually managed to capture Jamestown and burn it to the ground. Bacon actually died a month later from a fever, and the rebellion withered away. And this was over, I believe, a better part of a year that they were rebelling. But the wealthy landowners saw the potential destruction that should happen when the European and African laborers combined forces. The large numbers of laborers versus the few wealthy was very, very disconcerting. So there's this huge number of the working people that could overthrow those who were the wealthy elite because there was so few of them. And so word spread quickly about this, and there was actually several other uprisings, but they also ended up being quelled. Now, in response to this very disconcerting feeling for them, the wealthy landowners' response was first to establish some sort of form of social control to divide the masses. And so there's evidence of letters to Britain saying that they wanted to do this. And how they were going to do it was they were going to alienate the European from the African descendant. And what ended up being the result is the creation of the white race. So the process, it took many different forms over half a century. And it was essentially drawing a line of who is a slave and who is not. And so being a slave also means that your kids will be slaves. So that is hereditary. At the same time, there was many more bond servitude white men being diverted to the New World. So while it wasn't in Britain, they were trying to find people from other places to bring them over because these men would serve in militias to help deter uprisings. And it was a specialized version over time eventually would be called a slave patrol. So this led, of course, to an increase of white men in the New World. So first there was a lot of white men, then there were a lot of Africans, and then again, this increase of white men. So some rights were given to poor white men in as much as they were also taken away from black men. So free black men could not vote, they could not own white servants, and they could not carry arms. Whereas white men, as black men could not, move about freely without a pass, marry without any upper class consent, change employment, vote in elections in accordance with the laws of qualification, and they could acquire property. So the opposite is true because of this, is that black men had to have a pass to move around, had to have upper class consent to marry. They couldn't change employment, they couldn't vote, and they couldn't acquire property. And that was free. And so even enslaved people in indentured servitude and slavery, white men raising a hand against their master was 1 or more years added, whereas the punishment for a black man was raising a hand against any Christian white was 30 lashes, and killing was legal as long as it was deemed it was correction. Resisting recapture, it was only whipping if it was ordered by a justice of the peace for white people or for white men. And actually, they could seek legal redress if treatment or provisions was inadequate. So they could argue their case for running away if they were being treated very poorly. Whereas for black men, if they resisted recapture, anything up to killing was legal. So there you can see a very clear difference in the treatment of those in servitude. And then upon completion of servitude, for white men, 10 bushels of corn, 30 shillings in money, and a musket worth 20 shillings. For women, 15 bushels of corn and 40 shillings in money. And for black men or black women, nothing, as they would not ever be free. So the result is that those who are racialized as white, who are at the bottom of the social ladder, then felt more connected to the white people at the top, the wealthy elite, than to those racialized black, who are much closer to them in economic standing. So whereas this alienation, this divide, where the white men on the bottom of the social ladder, very, very close in social standing to their black neighbors, were now feeling more connected to those who were the elite. And that's where there's this huge divide there, which separated them with the creation of the white race that stopped basically these kind of uprisings. Okay, so the root of racism is at its heart one of colonialism and greed. Its creation is the result of the wealthiest creating a system which would keep them as such, and by turning those who would benefit from banding together against each other. So this is the point that I wanted to make by introducing all of these things, is helping people understand, because it made it easier for me to understand by understanding the root, understanding the cause, the beginning of it. And so I don't know, I have a bad habit of like falling down the rabbit hole for a lot of different things, and it's why I know the meanings of a lot of different words. But this is really what I wanted to get across, is that in order to understand racism, we have to understand where it came from, why it exists, and how it still continues to exist. Okay. All right. So that was so long ago, and about Black people. So what about now, and what about Asians? I explained why I thought it was easy, and so now hopefully I can bring this into a little more of the context. I'm not quite all the way here to the present day, but for an example is, I think as many people know, the Japanese American internment. So during World War II, the US was at war with Japan, Germany, and Italy. And yet the only ones who were interned on a complete scale were the Japanese and Japanese Americans. It would have been problematic for the government if the German and German Americans and the Italian and Italian Americans had come together with the Japanese to stand up for their rights. So looking into it, there were some German people that were interned, on a very, very small scale. However, supposedly, while there were people who thought they should intern all of them, the argument was that it was just too many people to intern. There was so many people that it wouldn't be feasible, whereas the number of Japanese Americans was small enough that they could do it. So if that was the problem, then if the German and Italian and their descendants were able to stand together and stand up with the Japanese to fight for their civil rights, it would have been very, very hard for the government to justify that. But it wasn't even just that. It was a split within the Japanese American community as well. So first we have to understand the JACL, which, I forgot to put in what that was, but the Japanese American Citizens League. So the inception of the JACL it was an umbrella organization of already existing Nisei organizations in California and Washington. So their first national convention was in 1930, and they lobbied Congress to amend the Cable Act, which stripped women of citizenship if they married men ineligible for citizenship. And they also lobbied Congress to secure citizenship for veterans of World War I. So this was the kind of, I guess, political action that they were trying to take at this time, worried about citizenship, which was a very important problem for them at that time. However, with the impending war, then JACL President Saburo Kido named Mike Masaoka as the executive secretary, the only full-time paid position in the JACL. And they took the organization in the direction of extreme Americanization. So they tried to distance themselves from the Issei in anticipation of the accusation that would be coming about loyalty. Then, both before and after Pearl Harbor, the JACL worked with the US government, the FBI, and the Office of the Naval Intelligence to try to characterize Japanese Americans as patriotic while uncovering possibly disloyal Issei. Even with internment, JACL leadership lobbied the War Department to allow Japanese Americans the right to be drafted to prove their loyalty in hopes of exonerating all Japanese Americans. There's also this Japanese American, oath or pledge or something that's super cringy to read. If you want to find that, I didn't want to put it in here. But the result of this was the 442nd and the No-No Boys. So the 442nd was an all-Nisei unit, which was one of the most decorated in the history of the US. There's plenty of things written about them if you wanted to learn more about them. The No-No Boys were designated as such after answering no to the loyalty questions, supposedly of 27 and 28 on the survey that they were given. And these were, question number 27 asked if Nisei men were willing to serve in combat duty wherever ordered, and asked everyone else if they would be willing to serve in other ways, such as serving in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps for women. Question number 28 asked if individuals would swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and forswear any form of allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. So the No-No Boys were people who answered no to both of these questions. Now, the JACL response was that the National Board of the JACL discussed what position they would take regarding those who had protested their wartime treatment, including those who had renounced the citizenship, had requested repatriation to Japan, no resistors, and draft resistors. They formally condemned all of it, contributing to decades of marginalization for Japanese Americans segregated at Tule Lake, Nisei draft resistors, and others labeled disloyal for their wartime resistance. Yeah, there's also more if you want to look into segregation and the Tule Lake playing that part, if you want to research that as well. But what's important, I think, for this lecture is you recognize that the JACL then formally denounced and condemned all of the people who answered no, anyone who resisted what was being done to them in any shape or form. So many years later, in 1990, they hired historian Deborah K. Lim to investigate the history of the JACL collaboration with the government during the war. The evidence Lim found was actually far more damning than the JACL has expected. She found that the JACL had done much more than cooperate, that they had not defended the Nisei rights as a civil rights organization that it would become in the years following the war. And after much debate, the JACL voted in 2000 to recognize and apologize to the Nisei draft resistors of conscience for the way they were treated during the war. So this is called the Lim Report, and you can actually find it on like an internet library somewhere. But initially, when it came back to the JACL, it was like something like 160 pages, and then the version they shared that they distributed without the JACLs was like, I don't know, 50 pages or something at it. So they like edited out all the bad things that they had done. But of course, you know, it came to light eventually. You know how quick things go in the Japanese American community. So people understood the role that the JACL had in suppressing people who were trying to stand up for their civil rights. Now, their legacy is that some states have a day of remembrance, of course, remembering the day when the Japanese Americans were interned, the Executive Order 9066. The federal government recognizes Go for Broke Day. So that was actually this month, April 5th, for the 442nd. And the Department of Defense has a page on their website speaking about the reason why they have that day. But there was no day, to my knowledge, commemorating the bravery of the Nono boys. So Ben Takeshita, who was a Nono boy, and he said himself that it took him a long time to admit that to anyone. But he was at the, I believe, plaque dedication ceremony at Tule Lake. And he said, how long is it going to take for us Japanese Americans to forgive and forget those years of violence and outright hatred created amongst us by the US government and US Army? Japanese Americans need to feel comfortable enough to admit that some of us were indeed no-nos and some of us were yes-yeses, and to agree that we sure were suckered fighting against each other. So this idea that it wasn't just within the Japanese American community, but the government and the army helped to stoke these fires that created the conflict within them to stop them from uniting. So even within the Japanese American community, they were divided about the right thing to do. And in my personal opinion, I believe everyone did what they thought was the right thing. Everyone was trying to do what they thought would keep them and their families safe, or you know, do the right moral thing. However, the drive to be American, whatever that means, separated them from coming together. The systems of government supported them to ensure that they would not have a united front. Thus, those in power were not challenged in any difficult way. So like I said in the beginning, if the Germans and Italians had bonded together with the Japanese, then it would have been a very big problem for the government. If the Japanese had bonded even within their own organization, it would have been a bigger problem than it was. But because they were able to fracture that community, the ones who were resisting were very small in number and pulled down even more so by their fellow Japanese Americans. So eventually, Japanese Americans were apologized to by the government, right? There was this whole redress movement, which the JCL actually was a good part of. And they worked together to rebuild and then start to try to overcome the racism that had been so prevalent in World War II. So not just Japanese Americans, but for many East Asians, what this meant was becoming the model minority. So this meant acting as white adjacent as possible, using traditional white American as the model. It meant distancing themselves from other minorities, keeping silent about inequality, and even going so far as to be racist against other minorities. That's where you start seeing anti-Black, anti-Latinx attitudes to try to separate, create some distance between other minorities to get as close and white adjacent as possible. Of course, though, as everyone knows, the model minority is a myth. First of all, that Asians are not a monolith. There is a huge wealth disparity, I think more so than any other ethnicity, between those who are wealthy Asians and those who are very, very poor Asians, because people who are refugees are included within this ethnicity, within Asian. And so people who are refugees, as well as people who have been here for 100 years, people who have come from very wealthy countries, Asian, this term Asian encompasses all those people. And so it's hard to say that they are a model minority. On top of that, what has trying to be a model minority done for you, whatever that means? And so here again is where I want everyone to question these terms or these ideas or these actions that we do. What does it mean to be American? What did it mean for our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents? What did it mean to them to be American? What does it mean to be Asian American ever since the inception of that term? What does it mean for us to be Asian American, to be Japanese American? And who are you trying to prove it to? And do they even care if you were to prove it in some shape or form? So one thing that really confused me is when people will go to Japan, Japanese Americans will go to Japan, and then they'll come back and they'll say, look how Japanese I am. I went to the motherland. And I'm absolutely for, people getting in touch with their ancestry, their roots, really understanding the culture, whether it's in the past or in the present. I think that's fantastic. But I had the great opportunity to live in Japan for a year, and never in my life did I feel more American. Because when you're in Japan, surrounded by actual Japanese people, you feel like such an outsider. You recognize that you do not belong there, that it's very, very strange to be surrounded in that kind of environment. So it was hard for me to understand how people could go there and then come back and say that they were more Japanese, because I went there and I came back as, yep, I'm pretty sure I'm American, because that's the feeling that I got when I was there. But again, these people, this feeling of having to say, look how Japanese I am, comes from some kind of, I don't even know, this would be interesting to research into, but this culture that we have of trying to prove how Asian you are, how Japanese you are. And when you really think about it, who are you trying to prove that to? And why? Why does that matter? And who cares if you are? It should be a question that all of us have to answer for ourselves. And it is an important question, I think, to what it means to be Asian American, what it means to be American, that each of us should really look into and understand and come to some kind of decision for ourselves what that means. But for anyone else, why are you trying to prove anything? And the same thing is what it means to be American. Who are you trying to prove that you're American? And is anyone really going to say anything or do anything? Do you get anything for it? Should you get anything for it? And the reason why I want to ask these questions, and hopefully people will start to think about them in this really kind of deep way, is because racism began as a form of social control by the wealthiest to keep them that way. Racism continues to divide the masses to keep the wealthiest that way. So no matter how much a minority group has gone through, no matter how much they've contributed, no matter how much they've assimilated, when it is convenient for them to be the scapegoat, the blame will be placed squarely on their shoulders to take the blame away from those who are truly at fault and pit one group against the other. So there might be these feelings that, Japanese Americans, they paid their dues, they fought in the war, they did all these things, but it doesn't matter. Whoever you're trying to prove it to, they don't care. It doesn't matter how much has been contributed, how much has been assimilated, how much culture you've lost in order to be more white adjacent. None of that matters, because when it becomes convenient to put that blame on some party, on some minority group, to turn everyone against each other so they do not have a united front, absolutely, you better believe that they will do it. So now, moving to the Buddhist portion of this. I did a lot of stuff that wasn't maybe necessarily Buddhist. So now we're going to tie it in with Buddhism. So the goal of Buddhism is the complete obliteration of the self, to extinguish your karma, no more rebirths. That was the goal of Buddhism, the Buddhism that Siddhartha achieved when he became the Buddha, and eventually into parinirvana, what he taught and what the goal of all Buddhists is. However, as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, we don't believe that that's possible in this life. And so this is my understanding, is that the closest that we can get to that is do your best to be kind. And in my understanding, Jodo Shinshu begins and ends with this. So what I mean by that is that in Jodo Shinshu, we're taught, do your best to be kind. And then we have to answer, why. And then after we answer why, the end result is, oh, I guess we have to do our best to be kind. Now, the reason why we have to ask this why is because we're all foolish beings. So for myself, if someone was to tell me that the only thing you have to worry about is to just be nice, my first thought would be to ask why. So I don't know if any of my old Dharma school teachers are on, but they're very used to me asking that. So when we look at ourselves, we realize that we are full of doubt as a result of our calculating mind, or hakarai. So that's the term that Shinran used. So this calculating mind arises from our selfishness. We find a way to rationalize our actions based on our skewed view of the world. So we have a view of the world which has us as the center of the universe, and everything that we do that we claim is good, or for the greater good, or for good for us even, is based on this skewed view, and we can justify it by the mental processes that make it so that it's okay for us to do those things, right? I mean, it's in the basic sense, it's like when you're trying to lose a couple pounds or something, you worked out, and so you think, well, I worked out, so I can eat this donut. When it's like, well, no, but we make it okay for ourselves, right? We say, I deserve this, I should have this, and it'll be okay. But I mean, if you do that every day, then you don't lose any. You actually would probably gain weight if you do that every day, if you ate a donut every day. But anyway, so it's just this example of how we rationalize our actions, even though they aren't good. Even if we know that they aren't good, we're very good at rationalizing these actions. So the path given to us in Jodo Shinshu to remedy the calculating mind is faith in Amida Buddha. So the opposite of relying on our own self-centeredness, right? If our view of the world is completely self-centered, if we use that as a guide, that would be wrong. So the only way to get rid of that is to rely on some other guide. And that guide for us as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists is the all-encompassing wisdom of Amida Buddha, wisdom and compassion of Amida Buddha. So here's the difference in how we see the world. So in Amida's view, all beings are connected, all beings are important, and all beings are suffering and in need of help. However, in our view, we are a separate entity from others. Only certain people are important, the people that we like, and our suffering is the most pressing. So there is a difference here where when we have a very self-centered view, we only care about ourselves, and we see that there's only us, and we are separate from other people. However, there is this view that is the opposite of that, where everyone is connected, all beings are important, and all beings are suffering. So we have to go from one way to the other, and we do that through our faith in Amida Buddha and using that as a guide for us. How do we do that? How do we go from seeing with our eyes into seeing Amida through Amida's eyes? We have to deeply reflect upon ourselves and recognize that we are foolish beings, and also that we are objects of wisdom, infinite wisdom and compassion. So first we got to admit, right, that we have this problem, and that is that we recognize that we do have this self-centered nature. When we see that, we can also see that somehow we are able to exist. We're able to live this kind of happy life. And it's because of the wisdom and compassion that surrounds us at all times. Now, when we truly understand these two things about ourselves, spontaneously, we will be full of gratitude and want to repay the kindness that we have received. So if you haven't felt that, then you probably haven't done the deeply reflecting enough. But if we recognize our selfish nature and how much we have to be grateful for, spontaneously, we will want to repay that kind of kindness because there is nothing else that we can do. So now I'm going to start to work backwards. When we see ourselves this way, we recognize our connection to all beings. Of course, we cannot repay everyone who has been kind to us, so we pay it forward. We understand that the suffering we have is the same suffering of all other beings. And so we do our best to live in the vow to save all beings from suffering, meaning we try to extend our compassion as Amida Buddha does. Now, if we want to extend our compassion, we want to do what Amida Buddha does. We are not Amida Buddha, we're not Buddha at all. And so we are still full of ignorance. And it's very hard to understand what the right thing to do is, even if we want to make some kind of action. So if we're all connected, we're all suffering, how do we choose what action we take to live compassionately? And this is through the wisdom of understanding what actions would be the most effective in helping the most people for the longest amount of time, right? So you could have compassion, which is completely devoid of any kind of wisdom. You think like, oh, you know, I think that Jeff Bezos guy, he needs more money, and so I better give him some more, which would be compassionate, but it wouldn't be very wise. We want to try to find the most effective in helping the most people for the longest amount of time. So now, continuing to work backwards, with this idea of hate and the hate crime, it's based on these differences that we have. Disability, gender, nationality, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, but all of these distinctions are created by our foolish minds. We must recognize that the discrimination based on these things is a product of the systems that reinforce inequality. So these distinctions that we have, they're all human distinctions. They're all created in the minds. None of these actually exist. As human beings, we're all just human. And so the reason why some are treated different than the other is because of these systems that reinforce inequality. Without those systems, then they would not be treated in such a discriminatory manner. And again, I wanted to put this in because I wanted to really hammer this point home, is that racism began as a form of social control by the wealthiest to keep them that way. Racism continues to divide the masses to keep the wealthiest that way. No matter how much a minority group has gone through, no matter how much they have contributed, no matter how much they've assimilated, when it is convenient for them to be the scapegoat, the blame we place squarely on their shoulders to take blame away from those who are truly at fault and pit one group against the other. So again, when we think about these distinctions that are created, they're created specifically to keep the wealthiest wealthy and prevent those who would benefit the most from banding together. Now, with that being said, what then would be the most effective action? So while it's important for us to stay safe and for those who do harm to see justice, the true culprit is the systems that perpetuate racism. If we were to find everyone who committed a hate crime and then to put them in, some kind of jail, like a facility or something, that is not going to end racism. That it just wouldn't. It would continue to happen over and over, depending on the time and the group that happens to be the problem at that point. Nothing will change unless these systems are abolished. So there's plenty of causes that need support to choose from, and it's up to each of us as an individual to decide what is the most important cause to them. So one of the great things about Buddhism is that it gives us the freedom and the responsibility to answer these questions for ourselves. So Buddhism doesn't tell us what to do. exactly in every single part of our life, right? What should we be doing as individuals? What should we be doing as temples? What should we be taking action? Should we be participating in civil rights issues? All these questions. It's up to each of us to study the teachings and then figure out what is best for us. And Jodo Shinshu, especially in my understanding, is made for people of all kind of faculties, from all kinds of walks of life. If you have a lot of free time and you're able to contribute a lot of money, if you're able to put yourself on the line, if you're able to do any of those things, if you can find a cause that you find is important to you, then if you can read the teachings and read it that way, then you should absolutely go for it. If you don't, if you can't spare a lot of your time, if you can't spare a lot of your money, if you can't do a lot outside of what you need to survive, what is it that you should be doing? It's up to you to read the teaching and understand what you can do to contribute in order to fight these systems. It's up to each of us to really figure it out, what is the best way for us to participate. But I think it is important for us to recognize that as Buddhists, as people who want to end the suffering of all beings, there is some kind of participation that we should be taking. I'm sure there's, other ministers, other forms of Buddhism, whatever, that will disagree with me. And that's the great thing about Buddhism, is that that's okay. They can disagree, and I'm perfectly fine with that. They can have a different opinion and understand what we should be doing in a different way. And that's okay. If they can study the teachings and that's what it tells them to do, then fine. But from my reading, from my understanding, this is what I feel like we should be doing. As an individual, there actually really isn't too much we can do. As a minority group, our influence, by definition of a minority, is limited. And so the only way we can make any real change is by coming together. We have to support one another so we can all be better. Minority or not, as the dismantling of these systems will benefit even white people who have been exploited for the system as well. I'm not trying to exclude anyone. As we were talking about before, these people who at the beginning of the creation of white found themselves much more identifying with people at the top than with the people who were closer to them in economic standing. They would have benefited by banding together and overthrowing those systems. So in the same way today, if someone who is a poor white person and they identify more with someone like Elon Musk or something than the Black neighbors that they have, who are in much closer socioeconomic standing, then they don't understand the kind of difference that could be made if they were to relate to that Black neighbor, if they were to come together and understand that a lot of their problems would be solved if they were to come together and solve them together. So a lot of the problems they share, and so if they were to be resolved, they would be resolved for both of them. And I wanted to conclude with this. So this is what is vital to remember, is that kind of tying it all together, as Buddhists, we recognize that the well-being of all outweighs the well-being of a few. As Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, we recognize that we exist in a system that is counter to this philosophy. So as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, we live in this world, right? It's hard for us to leave this world to live in a monastery. And so we recognize that we exist in this system, that we have to live in this system that is counter to this philosophy. In my personal opinion, the most effective way to disrupt the system is to work together with other minority groups with the goal of lessening the suffering of all. So again, it's not excluding anyone from this idea of ending the suffering from all. However, in working with other minority groups, we can start to come together to disrupt these systems that would end up helping all people and benefiting from the destruction of those systems. So that is the conclusion of my talk. I'll go ahead and stop the share now. How'd I do? What time is it? Oh, nice. Almost an hour.
You did really well. That's a little longer than the 6 minutes that you were afraid of. It's as I was listening to you, I was looking at my notes, because as you know, we had some questions and I was trying to really listen, but also mentally tick off the ones that you have answered so I don't ask you something that you've already answered. So just looking, I think one of the things that we had touched on, or one of the things that we were thinking of, is looking at Siddhartha's journey specifically because, there was a lot of hate that he received. And so I think a lot of the teachings that you mentioned probably were gleaned from that journey. So I think you touched on some of them, but if you could, you did put a lot of history into your speech, which I really appreciate, American history, but if we can look at some Buddhistic history as well. If there's something specific that you wanted to touch on.
Okay, I'm sorry. Was there a question in there?
It was kind of a roundabout question, but are
Okay.
there any specific historical things in Siddhartha's journey that you would like to point out, as you did, with American, you talked about the Bacon Rebellion. So is there something specific within, his journey that you wanted to point out as maybe something that had influenced specifically, the teachings and this concept of all? Well, we can move on.
I don't. Yeah. Well, like with Shakyamuni Buddha, like supposedly he had these magical powers, so he was able to deal with hate pretty good. Like, what is it? That there's a story of Angulimala, which translates to like garland finger or finger garland, and so supposedly he was a bandit that had so there's more of a history to this, and you could look at history too. It's very interesting, but he had supposedly had this kind of recollection, is that the right word, to be a very good spiritual student, and his teacher and like the students around him got jealous and said that he had made an advance at the teacher's wife, and so the teacher wanted to expel him, but he couldn't because Angulimala was really big, and so he said, well, you're almost done with your teaching, so what you have to do is you have to go out and get me 1,000 right index fingers, and then that's a traditional gift that you give your teacher, which was a lie. But he thought that if he told him to do that, eventually someone would come along bigger than him and kill him. But there wasn't. So he started killing people to take their right finger, and supposedly he was reincarnated as this kind of devilish being, because the concept, like, he could have taken them from corpses. But anyway, so he killed people and he took their finger and he started hanging them from the trees, but then birds started pecking at him. So then he hung them around his neck, and that's how he kept count of them. And he got up to 999, and he was going to kill the next person he saw to take their finger, who coincidentally ended up being his mother, who had a premonition that her son was this terrible person, because she had heard that there was someone who was killing people a lot, and that the king was going to go out and find this person and murder them. So she wanted to save him. And so he was getting ready to kill her. At the same time, the Buddha had a premonition that if she was to die by his hand, that he would be unsavable. So the Buddha went and tried to protect her. And so Angulimala saw her, depending on the story, either thought about it or didn't think about it, whether or not he should kill her, but then sees the Buddha and he goes like, well, if I don't kill my mom, that's okay. I'll just kill this guy. And he starts running after him. But as he's running after the Buddha seems to be getting further and further away, even though he has stopped moving. So Angulimala yells out at him. It's like, hey, stop. What are you doing? And so the Buddha says, I have stopped. It's you who has not stopped. And so this is this kind of, Zen thing where it like snaps into his mind about how he has to stop. And I think that he eventually becomes a great disciple of the Buddha. He ends up actually kind of getting the recompense of his karma through people like attacking him, even though he was a monk. But anyway, so I bring up this story because while it wasn't necessarily maybe like hate exactly against the Buddha was this dangerous aspect for him, where someone was coming at him with, very bad intentions, and the Buddha even wanted to save this person. So when we think about who it is that needs to be not necessarily saved, but who we should be helping, it shouldn't matter what they look like or what lifestyle they have or what kind of background they have or anything. There's nothing that should be stopping us from seeing humans as simply humans. Like, again, these distinctions that we have, they're created in our mind that the Buddha was able to break through. And so when we talk about all beings, the Buddha really meant all beings, anyone, even someone coming at him who was ready to kill him. He was willing to help that person as well. And so I'm not trying to equate anybody to like that kind of thing, but just that fact shows that it doesn't matter who the people are, we should be helping. There's also, it's not necessarily in his life, but one of the teachings of the Dhammapada is that one of the translations is that hate will never cease from hate. It can only be ceased through love. And so this idea that more hate or more anger or more negative feelings is not going to get rid of the negative things that we have already. It's only through love that we can solve any of these problems. And so for myself, you can be angry. It's okay. You can have anger. You can have frustration. You can be upset. But it's important to direct it at the correct cause. So if you direct it at these systems, then that hate is being used effectively. If you are hating these people who are a product of that system, it's misplaced. And instead, we should be showing compassion to those people. So we should be showing compassion to anyone who unfortunately has grown up thinking that there is this hierarchy of ethnicities, of races, of anything, and that anyone is to blame for any action. Like, we have to have this kind of compassion to recognize that those kind of people exist, and it is not the problem that they exist. The problem is the system. So again, to care, to love, to reach out to our fellow human beings in other minority movements, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's at the border, whether it's in any other way, when we're reaching out with love, that's what's going to end the hate. And so we got to figure out which way to do that. And again, it's this idea of extending it out to everyone, not just to a select few or something. This kind of idea of loving all. I don't know if that answered the question at all.
No, it did. It almost though kind of makes it seem like capitalism isn't very Buddhistic, and that in a Buddhistic view we should be a socialist society, right, where everybody benefits and where everybody helps everybody else. Is that what you're trying to say, or am I simplifying it too much?
I think I'm not a very, I have a long way to go as far as economics go. Like, I would not say that I am a master in any shape or form in that way. I think it can be read in a lot of different ways. And like, socialism is one, communism is one, right? If you were to have like no state or something, then supposedly that would be ideal. And I think a lot of people can agree that in a utopian society, we wouldn't have to worry about anyone, kind of getting more or less than another person, right? However, since we don't live in a utopia, since the world is not perfect, how do we exist in a way that is imperfect, but still taking care of everyone? And so this is the next thing I'm like working on, reading through all the different forms of, the market or whatever. I don't know. that would be maybe good, but definitely this idea of colonialism is not good, right? Because that implies that one person or one group of people is better than the other people because they're able to colonize them. So I think it's safe to say that colonialism is not good. Imperialism is not good. So anything in shape or form of that, I think would be not Buddhist. As far as starting to deal with the market and money and stuff, it's so far removed from Buddhism that it's really hard to make like a definite statement. But I think it'd be hard to argue that capitalism is good or and would be in the align with Buddhism, because of the vast disparity of wealth that exists. And so reconciling that with Buddhism, I think, would be very difficult, which is kind of a backwards way of saying yes. But like, I haven't quite grasped the hold of economic systems that I would like to definitively say something like that yet.
Just to address one of the comments that I did receive, we are recording this presentation, and so we will be posting it on our YouTube account, and we will try and disseminate it through our Facebook group to make it available to, because I know I will be rewatching it because it's been very, very helpful and interesting. I think one of the things that I really appreciated was that you put it in the context of history, right? Because it's always easier, I think, for me to understand something when I understand the whys, right, and the hows. So I think that's one thing that you did that was really, truly helpful. I did want to, so since, as a reverend and, for your temple, I kind of wanted to ask how you're guiding your temple and maybe what you feel the role of your temple or, the temple is in addressing some of these issues, right? Addressing the issue of racism, but also the issue, I guess, of hate that we also see.
There's, see, as a minister right now, since we're not gathering or anything, there's not a whole lot I could do other than the messages that I give, and so I do try to address issues that come up as they come up in kind of a timely manner. That's been one of the criticisms of ministers over the years, is that they don't really address present day social issues. So I mean, I do make it a point to try to do that. So I just put like a talk out, I think, for our, what was it, Hamasaki? No, Ohigan. I think Ohigan. Anyway, so that's there. It's also part of our newsletter. I think someone just put it on Facebook too. But anyway, so that's what I'm trying to do right now. As far as moving forward in the future, I think it is a great opportunity because this has really energized especially young people, but I think, across the generations, everyone is starting now to really think about these kind of things, and it's woken up a lot of people to it, myself included. I had to do a lot of work in education myself to really understand and then look to see what the next steps perhaps that we could do. And so when we are able to come back and we are able to do things together, I think it'll be much more of my prerogative to try to create some kind of community program. And what that is, I don't know. Like I'll have to work with, the temple. As all of you know, right, the temple are made up of people. They each have their own personalities. And so these temples end up having personalities, which I think is a really cool thing. They're like their own living, breathing organisms. And so for each temple, we have to figure out what it is that we want to do for our community on whatever kind of scale. And so I just want to keep that momentum now that it's in everyone's consciousness, right? I think it's, there was this kind of defining moment in history where, when George Floyd died, that now things will never go back to how it was. And so moving in that direction, how can we continue instead of stagnating or moving backwards or something? Admittedly, there wasn't a lot that I did in my career before that, but hopefully going forward, we can try to create something that will be effective and lasting within the community.
So you touch on the Black Lives Matter, speaking of George Floyd, and when you talk about Black Lives Matter and Asian Lives Matter, we have a question that asks, since both of those are good and it highlights the differences that are necessary, but then you have the All Lives Matter, and so there's and I understand that it's difficult because the concept of all lives matter is actually true, right? And you want to, especially if you want to propagate the idea of everybody coming together. So how do you separate the all lives matter from the white supremacist view of all lives matter?
That's a great question. And so I think I want to take this opportunity to plug two videos on, I think, YouTube. Yeah, I think I found on my YouTube that really helped me, and I think could also help people if you wanted to go a little bit more in depth. And so one of them is Birth of a White Nation by Jacqueline. Ooh, I forget what her last name is. But if you just put in YouTube Birth of a White Nation, she comes up and explains more in depth what I explained earlier. And then also Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man with Emmanuel Acho, and especially his conversation with the Petaluma Police Department. So I think that was really helpful too in understanding the relationship that we have, not just between white people and Black people, but also like people and like police. And so that was helpful as me. And so in that actual interview, that question came up, and understanding Black Lives Matter versus I guess that Blue Lives Matter, or like All Lives Matter or something like that. And so the whole purpose of saying Black Lives Matter is because it is the assumption that before, traditionally, they did not matter. It was treated as though they do not matter. And that's why we have to say Black Lives Matter. So it would be the same as saying, right, like that by saying all lives matter, or excuse me, all white lives matter, that traditionally, and before this, that white lives did not matter. And so we have to say that. But that's not true, right? And so that's the difference, where when you say Black Lives Matter, the reason why we say that is because historically, Black lives have not mattered. And you can point to the history in that there is actual laws stating how much a Black person's life is worth and related to a white man's worth, right? So we can point to something that says at some point in history, and even up until now, Black lives have not mattered. And so we have to tell people that Black lives do actually matter. And that's what helped, I think, one of the police maybe understand that concept a little bit better, is understanding why they had to say that. It wasn't that all the other lives didn't matter, but it's because historically Black lives have not mattered. And so we have to state that. Versus when you say all lives matter, it would be like saying all lives traditionally did not matter. But that's not necessarily the case, where it's like some lives within there did matter, some didn't. And so I get why it's confusing, and why people might fight or misconstrue that. However, when you start to understand the reason for why the Black Lives Matter movement exists, then you start to understand why it's phrased in that way.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think I appreciate the people who are sending me the YouTube links. So for those of you, we will be posting those in the comments section when we post the YouTube video, we'll be sure to include those links as well, so that other people can access what he's referenced. Because I certainly can't remember everything that you just referenced, all of the specific things, but I want to thank you for giving us so much information. I am just trying to make sure that we address everything that we wanted to address without repeating some of the things that you've already talked about. I think one of the things that we've, when we talk about anger, I think one of the things about the good and bad thing about Buddhism is that it's very simple, right? The concepts are very simple, and that's probably why you can talk about it in 6 minutes, because at its core, it's there. We should come together, right? At its core, we need to be kind. These are all very things. You can put them on a t-shirt and it's really quick. You can fit them. It's something that's very easy to understand, one would think. But in its practice, when we see a lot of these things, we get angry, right? We get frustrated. And so it's very easy to just say, be kind. But like, how do you counsel your congregation, your Sangha, to say, okay, this is how you can kind of work through it. This is how you work through the anger, and this is how you work through the frustration on a daily basis. Is there, are there ways that you say or that you tell your Sangha to help them kind of get through that?
So no, as one thing that I really wish is that people would talk to me like in that way. It would be like, hey, I'm having this problem, like what should I do about that? But no one ever asked me about those things. And so I don't know, maybe I haven't been here long enough or something, but just historically, people really haven't come to me with like their problems. But if they were to, there's a lot of different ways to deal with anger. And again, like, as I mentioned before, anger is okay. Like, it's okay to feel that way. As we are human beings, it's natural for us to feel anger. Obviously, to be consumed by it is not good, and to be angry at the wrong person is not good either. So if we are to direct our anger in the right way, then that's good. As much as I love words and the history of words and everything, we can't get hung up on them because like with desire, right? We say, oh, well, Buddhism is about no desire or something, but like, well, what if you desire to be really good at Buddhism? It's like, okay, you're getting caught up in it's the wrong thing. So the same thing with like anger, like it's like, oh, we're not supposed to be angry. It's like, okay, you're getting caught up in the wrong thing. Like we have to work with what we have. But also as far as maybe actual, practices to do with dealing with anger, it's also important to take care of our physical and mental well-being. So if you feel like it would benefit you, I absolutely encourage people to go to mental health professionals. There has been some, stigma in like older generations as far as what that means, but I think younger generations are more open to it. And if you can get that help, then that's great. The practices that I can recommend would be to really disconnect for a little bit. It can be hard when it seems like there's bad things happening every day in the news. Obviously, we don't want to turn a blind eye to it, but sometimes we just need a break. On top of that, there's also different kinds of mindfulness or meditation practices that we can do to center ourselves. Of course, you can chant. You can go to a service that, for me, helps. But if you kind of look up maybe some like breathing exercises, because I could lead one, but you can also look up breathing exercises or like a metta practice, trying to send compassion to where it needs to go. Not that, as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists necessarily believe that we can generate some kind of compassion to like send it, but I think there is something to mentally formulating and imagining that to eventually become actualized. So I think that helps as also something as trying to be not just compassionate to others, but also to yourself.
When talking about compassion, it's like the opposite of compassion is that feeling of revenge or, wanting others to be held accountable, right? And so I think it's pretty natural that like, especially when you see the hate crimes and when you've experienced discrimination, you talked about, internment. And I think what are ways that you would counsel, about compassion and how to get yourself from that, for the feeling of revenge and that feeling of being discriminated against to to where we can show and where we can be compassionate. How do we get there?
So this might not be maybe the way people like agree the most with, but I guess that's suppose that makes it my interpretation. But that as I mentioned, that the goal of Buddhism is the obliteration of the self. And so for us to break down that barrier of me and you, myself and other, whoever I am and the person who is like a bad person, right? When we break down that barrier and recognize that we are one and the same. And one of the ways of understanding that would be to put ourselves in that person's shoes and to truly do that, to really do that, to be like, what was it that put this person in that position? What causes and conditions put them in that position? And am I any better than that? If I was put in the same place and time, if I was put in the same conditions, would I be any different? And so one of the great illustrations or examples of this is our founder Shinran Shonin and his connection with the Prince Ajatasattu, who under the influence of Devadatta, the Buddha's cousin, who's kind of a jerk, wanted to take the throne for himself and ended up imprisoning his father. And then he was going to wait for him to die, but then his mother kept them alive by putting some kind of like honey and flour on her body and filling her jewels with like juice and stuff. And it's not explained explicitly how they survived, but he did survive. And so he got really mad, and then he sent his I think, depending on the story, it's his barber or like someone else to go kill his father. And again, depending on the story, it could be really gruesome or not. But he does that, and almost at the same time, his wife goes into labor and has a child. And so he's holding his son for the very first time, and he feels how much he loves his son and how much he would do anything to make him happy. And he asks his mom, like, hey, is this how my dad felt about me? And his mom goes, of course, that's exactly how he felt about you. There was a time when I was pregnant and I wanted the taste of blood. And so he cut his finger and he let me drink the blood from his finger. And then after you were born, you had this boil on your finger, and your dad sucked on your finger to make the boil go away or to soothe it. And it popped in his mouth. And instead of going, ugh, and spitting it out, he just ate it, whatever came out of your finger, because he loved you that much, because he didn't want you to feel unhappy. And so he realizes a mistake and he goes to stop him, but it's too late and his father has died. So this kind of person who was willing to like kill his father, and then later on in the story, he gets really mad at his mom. He's about to kill his mom too, but his advisor's like, no, don't do that. So he's ready to kill his mom too. He's overwhelmed with his sense of guilt and like self-remorse, so much so that it starts to take physical expressions, I guess, and like really smelly boils, and it's gross. But this is the person that Shinran identified with the most. He quoted the sutra that this is from, the most, Nirvana Sutra. And so this character that he identifies with, someone who is so terrible that feels such guilt, I think is a great example for all of us to understand who we should be identifying with, right? It's not us that should be looking down on other people. It's not us who should be judging other people. We recognize that we too are human beings, that we are capable of these terrible actions, that we put in the same situation might do the same exact thing. And when we can do that, then you can really extend that compassion, because then you understand someone truly. You actually understand them, not on some kind of like service level or something, but you feel that you are the same person. And so that's really where compassion can combat anger, when you put yourself in that position. It's very, very hard to do. Just because you can say it, I can say it so easily, doesn't make it easy to do. But that's really the practice that would help to ease that kind of anger. And then, as I was talking earlier, to have that compassion of seeing that they're just the product of this system, and that it's not them that we should be angry at, it's the system. Because if we were in that same system, in that same position, who's to say that we wouldn't do the same thing?
What I really enjoyed about your presentation is talking about how it is individual, even though it's communal, right? At a certain point, we have to put aside our selfishness and put that aside, but we still have, but our journey is individual, right? And so I guess what I would ask, or you talk about understanding the teachings, what are besides just, going to church and hearing different, different messages, are there any texts, are there any learnings, or are there any specific things that you could recommend that we can, to help us on our journey, to help us understand the Buddhistic teachings? What are the different things that you would recommend for us to go down that rabbit hole?
Sure. I just Google a lot of stuff, but that's just me. I suppose you could talk to your minister, of course, right? There are great resource. I wish people would come up to me and be like, hey, I want to know about more Buddhism. Like, what should I do? And I could, depending on, what they're looking for or what they kind of questions they need answered, might be able to help. A lot of the Jodo Shinshu texts are very difficult to read without a teacher. So, I mean, that might be something too that you ask for, like a study class or something, or even maybe just like an excerpt or something that they could help you with. Let's see. I mean, just kind of like a general thing, the, what is it? Shinmon? I think the last Monshu, not this Monshu, but the previous Monshu wrote 3 books, and they were, I think, really easy reads, but then also very great into understanding Jodo Shinshu. Let's see. I mean, those books, the study classes, just talking to ministers. I don't know. It's up to like each of us to really figure out how the best way for us to learn is, what we find most interesting. I'm fortunate enough that school wasn't too difficult for me, so I could go to Institute of Buddhist Studies and learn, and I enjoyed it, which is, in my opinion, very fortunate. It's not a knock on anybody, because not everyone learns the same way. Not everyone can learn in the same circumstances. And, like I've got friends that have learning disabilities, and that's just, how it is. And so it can be difficult for people to do like graduate level courses or something. But I mean, that's a great resource, as well as the Jodo Shinshu correspondence course. But yeah, I mean, I think on a personal level, if you just start talking to people, like my I guess ideal vision of the future is that people would have conversations about Buddhism outside the temple, just like at home, just hanging out and, talking about that stuff. Like if you had your own study group that you organized with your friends that you wanted to talk about Buddhism that bad, like that would be amazing. So these kind of things where you just start talking to people, if you talk to your Dharma school teacher, if you talk to your just friends and family, like about that stuff, I think it starts to get the questions going. A lot of people know things that you might not even know they know. And they might have read a book that they could help you with, but there's all these resources out there that you can look into. And it's really, like you said, it's individual. It's really up to everybody, the best way for them to learn. The Sacramento Buddhist Church, we post all of our Dharma talks online. So if you want to just sit there and just scroll through them, you could do that too. But whatever's best for anyone.
Well, I want to thank you for giving us so much of your time and for allowing us to pick your brain and to give us so much of your thoughts. It's been a real privilege to be able to speak with you and hear your thoughts and just, be a part of tonight. I don't know. I don't mean to speak for everybody, but personally, this has kind of taken me back to the times, in college where we would have these discussions, and it's been really, really illuminating. So I want to thank you. To let you know you're off the hook. There's no more questions. It's just been so interesting. So thank you very, very, very much. I want to turn it over to Jerry and to Reverend Kory, but I want to thank all of the people who have been present this whole time and who've hung in there. I hope you have found it as in rewarding as I have. It's just been so interesting.
Just going to echo what Michelle said right now. First, Reverend Matt, thank you so much for being with us tonight. You gave us a lot to think about. And, I know Michelle said it's the last question that you have tonight, but I have a hunch that people know where you are and they're going to come and ask you a lot of questions after this too. So to me, that's always one of the most fun things about Jodo Shinshu, is that you never get a simple answer that just causes the issue to end and go away. So this is part of the fun of it, right? So the questions probably will still be coming. To everybody else that joined us, please, thank you very much for being part of this event today. We broke 100 at one point, so my goal was achieved. Hopefully we can do that for a Sunday service soon too. So, we never know. By my last count, we had at least 7 states and Canada represented tonight. So we had people from all over the place. So Tanis Moore, I noticed you're from Manitoba. So thanks for joining us from way up north. And, this was a very unique and new event for our temple. I think Reverend Matt talked about it. This was spurred by our young folks, that they're most energized about doing things, and contrasted with some of our older folks who I think fall into that model minority category that Reverend Matt talked about, where they were concerned if we do too much in this way, we might bring some attention to the temple that we don't want. But ultimately, I think all of the different groups within our Sangha work together to put this on. So we hope you all got something to take out of this. And I know there are many other activities like this going on all over the place. And so, we're just glad to be part of that. Special thanks to Monica Belly Haley, who got us started in kind of driving this event, and Michelle Orne for taking the charge for finishing, put the finishing touches on it, for leading us tonight. And of course to our Reverend Kory Quon for guiding us through this and helping us steer this and shape the event to make it what it was. And again, a big thank you, Michelle mentioned in the beginning, to the Southern District Buddhist Women's Association, whose grant helped us put the event on tonight. So when we're done, you will be getting shortly by email a survey that will just ask for your feedback on tonight's event. That will help us really as we consider the rest of what we did call it a Sangha series, and we do contemplate having a few more events. So we'll invite you to join again in the future, but your input is welcome. And you might see a couple of ads for some upcoming activities we have too. Going forward, I think I just want to share one last thought with you. So, ultimately our board is very much in support of helping our Sangha get through this and really to help tackle these issues a little more broadly. I think the way that we look at it is we're looking to promote things or host things like this, where we increase awareness of these issues, but also really promote a positive message of diversity and inclusiveness. And that's really what I think is important to all of us. And I'll just leave you with a couple of hashtags that you will see us using, starting with the Obon t-shirts that we're going to sell later. That's my commercial. But on our Facebook posts and our messaging, and it's hashtag Minna Nakayoshi and hashtag everyone together. And that's one way we think we can help promote rebuilding to a point where we don't have to talk about these kind of issues going forward. So we have a long way to go, but at least this is a good start. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. And I think we're ready for Reverend Kory to do Gassho.
I wanted to just thank everyone again for joining in tonight. I hope you learned a lot and have a lot to take with you so that you could grow internally and then change others. But also thank you to Reverend Matt again for being able to take the time out of his busy schedule to share the wisdom and the teachings with each and every one of us. So with that, if you could please put your hands together and join me in Gassho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namandas, namandas, namanda, no, namanda. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jerry, and thank you to the Sangha Initiative for putting all of this together. And yeah, I hope we do have more of these functions in the future. So thank you.